Jellyspoons, welcome back to part 2. Hello, dog. Come here. Doggo has come to say hi. Say, I didn't like the movie Hook either. I don't think he did, to be fair. He slept through most of it, so, yeah. Good boy. Hey. Okay. So, welcome to part 2. This is a 2-part rant series where I am completely dissecting the movie Hook from 1991. Now, this is part 2, and I am going to be taking some of their themes, some of the scenes that they included, some of the casting, some of the characters, some of the sets and everything, all the really awesome stuff and really good stuff that they did. I am going to be using that, and I am going to be writing my own version of the movie and how I think it should have gone. Now, first of all, I would like to say that if I was going back in time to redo this movie, I would just make the original Peter Pan story. I would stick to the play and the book Peter and Wendy, and I would just tell that story because particularly at that point in 1991, we hadn't really had a full colour live action adaptation of Peter Pan. We'd had a black and white one, I think we had a couple of black and white ones like really early on. We'd had obviously the stage adaptations and we'd had the Disney version. So I guess people didn't maybe want to touch it because the Disney version was so well known and iconized that people didn't want to do it. I don't know. I am going to try to keep as much as I can of what they did do with the story while changing the plot so that it makes more sense both canonically and in a sort of more fun way. I'm going to keep things like, for example, all of the sets were fantastic and amazing. I think the music is great and could fit for my version as well. I'm also going to keep Rufio. I really enjoy Rufio as a character. Now, originally I had thought that they could just do the original Peter Pan and Dante, the actor, could have just played Peter Pan. I still think that would work, and that is my ultimate fantasy headcanon. This happened in another life. Dante played Peter Pan and that movie was amazing. But stepping away from the original story to remake it as our own, I'm going to keep Dante as Rufio because I think he could have a really interesting role to play in a more canonical Peter Pan story. So here we go. This is me rewriting the movie Hook. God save us. The movie opens on a dark sky. It's nighttime, there are next to no stars, you are high, high in the air, there's wind, there's no music, and it's just quiet and eerie. You hear the sound of flapping, it's fabric, material, something flapping in the breeze. You see a child. They look quite young, no more than 12 maybe. They are flying through the air. They look pale, they look frightened. They are completely alone in this dark sky. And the camera moves backwards and you see this child, just a tiny pinprick in this blackness. And for about a minute, maybe 2, you just have this quiet silence of this child flying onwards into this unknown nothing. And then you see a golden flash. Stars start to illuminate and the light brightens ever so slightly. And somebody else has appeared and is flying alongside this child. They have starlight in their eyes. Their skin glistens with a million golden arrows. They're dressed in leaves and vines and cobwebs. This is Peter Pan. And of course, Peter gets the first line of the movie. He says something like, "Don't be frightened." The child looks, the child blinks, the child is surprised, but they sort of nod and they sort of smile. And Peter gives a sort of encouraging, "Come on." And on they fly. They fly together through this darkness. And then after a little while, the music builds and we see this slow building light. It's white and gold and silver and it sparkles and glistens on the horizon and it gets slowly bigger and bigger until maybe it encompasses almost the entire horizon. And as they get up very close to it, Peter slows and he sort of gestures to the child and he says, "Go on." The child eventually sort of smiles. Maybe they manage to laugh. And then they fly on into this light and they disappear. Then we cut back to Peter. We see this brilliant, bright light reflected in his face, in his eyes. He has an expression that, to quote Matt Mercer, is hard to read. It's not quite fear, it's more an uncertainty, a wariness. He doesn't trust it. He keeps staring for a moment longer, and then perhaps he shrugs nonchalantly. It's up to the actor whether they mean it or not. It's also up to the audience whether we believe him or not. But then Peter turns away, and he flies back through the darkness. The next thing we see is Peter coming out of the darkness, high in the air over a cityscape. We follow Peter as he swoops down and we see his energy start to pick up again. He's enthusiastic, he is happy, he's cheerful. He spins around chimney pots, and then he flutters down to a bedroom window. We see him as he sort of sits, nestled, and he listens to a story. Maybe a mother is telling her children a rapturous tale. He grins. He flies on. He goes to several other windows. There are parents telling their kids bedtime stories. There are kids playing and acting. Some of them are fairy stories. Some of them are tales of Peter Pan. We recognise a lot of the stories that are being told. We hear things of Captain Hook, of pirates, of Tinkerbell, of Wendy. Peter actively does not recognise anything. And it sows those seeds that Peter doesn't remember his adventures from before. But it doesn't matter if we pick up on that just yet. At the last window Peter visits, we see him settle down to watch a group of children playing at being Peter and the Lost Boys. They're fighting some pirates. They are winning. They tell the story, the kids are cheering. Then one of the children, possibly an older sibling, maybe they have joined in, maybe they haven't, sort of looks over at the rest of them and says something like, "You know that it's only pretend, don't you? You know it's only make-believe. Peter Pan is just pretend." Peter is indignant and disheartened by this, and he flies away from the window. We then follow him as he flies back to the Neverland. And we follow Peter as he flies over the island, and we see how it has changed. We recognise things like Maroon as Rock, the Mermaid Lagoon, we see the lakes going through the Neverland, we possibly see mountains, however we want the island to look. That's what we see, all the adventures nicely crammed together. When Peter lands, he plays with the Lost Boys. We see him arrive and they're dynamic with him. When I say Lost Boys, I don't mean they all have to be boys. I mean, that's just what they are called. For the sake of argument, Lost Boys is just the title of the gang. There can be girls, there can be gender fluid, whatever they want, but bear in mind, they are kids, so don't focus too much on that. Just, there are Lost Boys, that's a gang. We see some of the personalities of these Lost Boys develop. Peter arrives, he crows, they play games. We explore for a scene their dynamics and how that relationship works. The Lost Boys were maybe out patrolling the island. As soon as Peter gets back, things change. You see that while Peter was gone, they didn't necessarily have all their weapons on them, they weren't necessarily dressed properly, but as soon as Peter gets back, everything is on, they've all got their weapons, they're ready to go, they go on some adventures, they play, they hunt, any number of things. We need to show at this point some of the things that people don't always show about Peter Pan the character. One of the things he does is that when him and the Lost Boys are fighting another group of people, whoever they are, sometimes Peter will get bored if they're winning too easily, and he will then shout, "I'm going to be them today," and he'll swap roles. And sometimes the Lost Boys swap with him, but sometimes they fight against him. You can also show how Peter is very quick to go from one thing to the other, and the Lost Boys are trying to keep up all the time. You could possibly also have a scene where the Lost Boys all salute Peter, or they're all standing in a row to sort of be like, "Yes, we're here, Peter," and they've all gone to get their stuff. And Peter can say, "There's more of you." And they can start to say like, oh yes, some more arrived last night, or some more arrived last week. But Peter will cut them off and interrupt and say, "Okay then, more to play." And then they'll go off and they'll play and they have these adventures. And it is all fine. It is all fun. They are all having a good time. But you are, again, just sowing those seeds of Peter doesn't remember a lot. And Peter is very quick to go from one thing to the other, and the Lost Boys just follow. That's what they do. They go along for the adventure, and that's important for later. At one point, they're playing a game where they're sort of chasing and tearing around the island. Some of them are flying, some of them are on the ground. Maybe they're fighting another group of people or some creatures, something like that. It's all in play and it's all part of the fun. They will zoom past a cluster of trees, and on one of the trees, as someone runs past and brushes it, maybe it's Peter, maybe it's somebody else, they brush away some of the moss that has been overgrowing on one of these trees, and the moss starts to fall off, and you see carved into this tree is the name Wendy. At some point while they're playing, Peter will get bored of yet another game that they're playing, and he will fly off announcing the next game. It'll be something at the lagoon, maybe they're going to play bubbles with the mermaids, something like that, and Peter will go shooting off into the sky. And at this point, we introduce the pirates. They creep up behind them, and while the Lost Boys are looking around and going, "Oh no, where did Peter go? What are we doing next? What?" The pirates launch their attack, they kidnap the Lost Boys, and they take them to the pirate ship. At this point, we'll get to see more of the pirate dock. I really like what they did with this in Hook. It was an overgrown sort of port town. It had loads of streets and loads of people and characters and everything. We can keep all of this, and also I love the sets. So I really want to make use of those pirate ship sets. So the pirates will drag the boys onto a pirate ship. We will pan over the pirate port and the harbour and things. One of the things we will also see is the wreck of the Jolly Roger, Captain Hook's pirate ship. Now this was taken by Peter and the Lost Boys. They used it to get the Lost Boys, Wendy, John and Michael, back to London, and then Peter and Tink flew home. I like to imagine that the Jolly Roger eventually was just washed up as a wreck, and it came to rest at the Neverland, sort of like a homage to where Hook fell. Just off, out of the way in the water, but we can see the Jolly Roger written across the stern. And we will meet the antagonist of the movie. Now I'm going to take the lead from Hook the movie here, and I'm going to set my movie in a later time period, And as we have already seen, Wendy, John and Michael are no longer on the Neverland, so this is later in time. So canonically, once Wendy, John and Michael had left, Captain Hook was dead and done for. So this is a brand new antagonist. I'm going to keep them a pirate because I think it just works. They just seem like natural adversaries. Peter Pan versus pirates. Also, I love pirates. So I am going to be referring to the antagonist of my piece as the antagonist. I'm going to give them they, them pronouns simply because I don't care whether they are male, female, anywhere in between, and it doesn't really matter for the story. At this point, I'll just write the character and then cast whoever. It can be Dustin Hoffman. I love him. I think he's great. If he comes to play this character, that'd be great and fine. But in terms of who it is, it really doesn't matter. They are just the antagonist of the piece. As the Lost Boys get closer and closer to the captain's cabin, we see hints of the antagonist, maybe their hand on a map, maybe they are drinking something, that kind of thing. You show them in snippets, and you only see their face when they turn to address all of the Lost Boys. One of the things you will notice is that they have been taking a lot of detailed notes. They have loads of pieces of parchment, and you can see that they are tracking days and times. It says things like away and back, and there's things like 3 days, 3 weeks, a month, 2 months, that kind of thing. They've been keeping an eye on something. As the Lost Boys are brought in front of the antagonist, the pirates who captured them will inform the antagonist that they caught all but one of them. The antagonist is pleased with this. They say this will do well, Peter will come and save them. Then we cut to another scene. We see somebody is moving fast through the treetops. They have leaves and scraps of clothing and things. You maybe see their shoulder and they press on. They're moving fast. And then you cut away. Back on the ship, to give homage to the movie Hook, perhaps the Lost Boys are up in a net. So this whole scene I will keep fairly similar to when Mr. Banning has to come and rescue his kids and they're up in the net, except the new antagonist has taken one of the Lost Boys. There is one Lost Boy who is not in the net, and they are stood, held, sort of in the arm of the antagonist, right on the plank. They've got a gag in their mouth, their hands are tied. You can't quite see the face of the Lost Boy yet because they're sort of half buried in the captain's arm. And we wait. Then we cut back to more flashes of this hurrying figure. We see a shadow on the ground. We get hints that it might be Peter. You hear panting and breath, and you see, as hands push trees out of the way, you can see the pirates' dock and the ship where the Lost Boys currently are. You can see it slightly off in the distance. Once again, we cut back to the pirate ship. The antagonist, still holding on to this one Lost Boy, is proclaiming to both the boys and their crew that they will be victorious where others were not. You hear a sort of ooh amongst some of the pirates, and it seems to be that this antagonist has been raising them, building themselves up to be the new captain. They want to be in charge. You get a hint that they are nearly there, but they haven't quite done enough to convince all the pirates to completely agree with them. As they say, they will succeed where others have not. Their eyes pan, and you see some of the pirates look too, maybe even the Lost Boys, and they look once again at the wreck of the Jolly Roger, and we are reminded of Captain Hook. Now, Hook obviously is dead, so I don't want anyone to necessarily have the hook, but maybe the antagonist has something of Hook's. Maybe they've got a Hook tattoo or something that shows that they are trying to live up to this legacy and overcome it. And that tiny twinge of ever so slight unhingedness is shown there as well, but just a little bit. Just as we are looking over at the wreck of the Jolly Roger and getting these hints about the antagonist's nature, we hear a crow. The Lost Boys cheer, victorious. Peter is here, he's going to save us. And thus we have Peter. He swoops down, lands right before the antagonist, and draws his sword. The antagonist takes a few slow steps back along the plank, still holding on to this Lost Boy. Peter is now in front of them, holding his sword, and he demands that the boys be let go. The antagonist laughs for the first time, and we hear just how evil and maniacal this new baddie is. And they tell Peter that fighting will not win the game this time. At this point, the Lost Boys in the net are still shouting things. Some of the pirates are sort of laughing and jeering, siding with the antagonist. Some of the pirates are interested in what's going to happen. A lot of them are brandishing their own swords, and they're just stood there watching. The antagonist says all that Peter has to do to win the freedom of all the boys is one simple thing. And in a quick passing reference to something that happens in the original story, Peter will gnash his milk teeth. And then Peter will say, "Name it." The antagonist will grin at this. And in a similar vein to how Captain Hook spoke, they will say, "A princely idea." Then the antagonist explains the one simple rule of this game. The only thing that Peter has to do to win the freedom of all the Lost Boys is say the name of the Lost Boy the antagonist has clutched in his grip with a knife to his throat. The Lost Boys start to cheer and shout things, but they're silenced by the pirates to keep them quiet. Peter is silent. The Lost Boys continue to say things, but quieter amongst themselves. The pirates are grinning, listening, paying attention. The antagonist is staring Peter down, and that smile has not disappeared. The boy in their arms is sort of struggling a little bit, but every time the knife is getting held closer and closer, and we still can't quite see them. And Peter is silent. And he's holding the sword. And it's not shaking, because Peter's not a shaky character, but it is lowering slightly. And Peter is still sort of baring his teeth. And the anger is there, but something in his eyes is different. And this goes on for a little while. And much like in the movie Hook with the banning kids up in the net, I really want to have a scene where the kids in the net are reaching out and calling for a savior who just can't save them. We hear more shouts and cries, "Come on, Peter!" from the Lost Boys. Some of the pirates are jeering, and some of them who weren't quite sure about what's going on are starting to laugh now as they see what the antagonist is doing. Peter opens his mouth, but can say nothing at all. We cut to the smallest, the youngest of the Lost Boys. I think in the movie he was called Pockets, I'm not sure. But we cut to the smallest and youngest of the Lost Boys up in the net, and very quietly, we just hear him say, "He doesn't know, does he?" This quietens some of the other Lost Boys, and they're all sort of clutching the net, much like the banning children were reaching through, like, "Come on, Peter, come on." And they're watching. And the pirates, you just hear this ripple of mirth. And we go back to the antagonist, who still has that grin and has said nothing more. And they're just looking at Peter. And then the antagonist draws the Lost Boy in. And we hear them, but no one else hears them say, "Forgotten already? Pity." We see the Lost Boy sniff, perhaps a tear as he shakes, and he's being held by this antagonist. And then the antagonist shouts loud enough for everyone to hear, "Thus fails the illustrious Peter Pan." Quick as a flash, before anyone can react, he stabs the Lost Boy. And you can hear shouts. The pirates are laughing, the Lost Boy is shouting, "No!" As the blood starts to pool down their chest, we see Peter lurch forward, his sword slightly lower now as he lurches towards the boy, but it's too late. They're dead. And in much the same way as Captain Hook easily disposed of one of his own men, the new antagonist shoves the Lost Boy's body off the edge of the plank, and they disappear under the surface of the water. Gone. Peter is staring down into the water. The thing that's hit Peter the most in this instant is that he failed at something. And that's the expression on his face as he's staring down into the water, this realization dawning on him that he failed. There was something he couldn't do. And while he's staring down into the water, the antagonist is sort of laughing, basking in the laughter of the pirates, and he addresses the rest of the Lost Boys, and he says things like, "Your leader has failed you. He will fail you time and time again. He abandons you." Go on to say that Peter will forget each and every single one of them in time, and there is nothing they can do. They talk about the sort of mournful fate that these boys are going to have, and the antagonist suggests that going home to grow up would be a kinder fate. Some of the Lost Boys are shouting back and disagreeing. You can see some of them are listening. Then we cut to the hurrying figure again. They are scaling the side of the pirate ship. We see them leap and jump. We cut to like a boot landing on the deck of the ship. A hand lands as well, sort of superhero landing style. And this, of course, is our introduction to Rufio. He stands up, looks around, immediately takes in the situation, brings out 2 swords, because why would he not have 2, and starts fighting his way through the pirates. He then can possibly clamber up, similar to how Mr. Banning did, and he can get up to the Lost Boys and hack a hole through the net for them and get the Lost Boys out of the net. The Lost Boys can all jump down. They all join in the fight, and they start fighting their way through and out of the pirates. I'm in 2 minds as to whether I want Peter to join in, because on the one hand, he would, it's a fight, it's Peter. I also like the idea that Peter is just so dumbstruck by what's just happened that he is just standing on the plank and staring down at the water, and he sort of barely registers what's going on. So either one of those will happen, but at some point, Rufio and the rest of the Lost Boys are getting to the edge of the ship. They are diving off the ship to swim and fly away. However they want to get off, they can swim or fly. And at some point, as Rufio is like getting them all off, he suddenly shouts, "Wait, where's Ace?" Because I looked up the names of some of the Lost Boys in this movie, and I chose which one I wanted to kill because they looked sweet and innocent, and they have blonde fluffy hair, and they're just the perfect candidate to die. Sorry, Ace, I'm sure you're great, but in my movie, you're dying. So Rufio's there on the edge of the ship, probably on the bow, getting all these Lost Boys off, and he shouts, "Where's Ace?" And the Lost Boys around him, their faces fall, and they don't need dialogue at this point to communicate what has happened, like this boy is dead. I think what should happen next is that Peter should be fighting some pirates and starting to enjoy it. He should be forgetting his sadness very quickly. He's laughing. I need to see Peter with a smile on his face very quickly, and it can be unsettling for the audience to see just how quickly this boy can turn around into joy and enjoying himself again. So he's fighting possibly the antagonist, possibly a group of pirates, but Peter is fighting. And then we see from Peter's eye point of view as he catches Rufio up on the bow of the ship. And one of the other lost boys, maybe don't ask, the sort of greaser one, it doesn't matter, they are speaking to him, maybe whispering in his ear, and they're pointing at Peter. And Rufio turns and looks at Peter, and they lock eyes. And you know, without dialogue here, that Rufio knows what Peter did. And Peter doesn't necessarily have a big reaction to this, but we as an audience can respond. And Peter is still laughing and fighting the pirates, and we just see that look on Rufio's face. Oh, and it's not good. Rufio is so mad. Now, at this point, the pirates have stopped fighting. Maybe some of them turn to Peter. And Peter has maybe paused because he's watched Rufio dive away. Like, Rufio doesn't care if Peter survives this fight or not. He knows he probably will. And then the antagonist sort of walks towards Peter in this silence. And the antagonist can say something taunting. Perhaps they'll forget you right back. Peter who? Pan. Never heard of him. He's just pretend. He's only a story. And this will strike a nerve in Peter. Maybe he'll come towards the antagonist and be shouting something like, shut up, shut up! And then the antagonist is going to show some of the knowledge that they have. They will say something to Peter akin to, don't you remember any of it, boy? They will mention hundreds of lost boys who have come before. They might mention the darlings and how it's just been constant and over. Do you not remember any of them? Now, at this point, I would like to mention that in my movie, I am also sticking to the stage direction of Peter is never touched by anybody. I really want to play on that unearthliness of he cannot be touched. So whenever anyone leans into Peter, they're like this close, but they're not close. But the antagonist will lean in and they will say, rumor has it he bested you once on Maruna's Rock. Peter can sort of look out and we can all sort of see Maruna's Rock in the distance and it's growing smaller. There's like the stake tarpaulin thing in it. And Peter will instinctively like clutch at his arm. And this is where we'll notice properly. It's always been there, but we'll see it clearly. There are 2 hook claw scar marks on Peter's arm from where Hook clawed him twice on Maruna's Rock. And we'll have a flash of memory as Peter looks out of the rock and sort of clutches his arm. We'll go with that theme they had in the movie Hook of remembering and your past and things and repressed memories. And Peter will have a flash of memory. We'll all see this flash of memory. We'll see from Peter's point of view as he scales Maruna's Rock trying to catch a breath. And then we'll see Hook rise up the rock on the other side. Peter offering him an arm, realizing that he's higher up the rock than his foe and it wouldn't be fighting fair. And then we'll see those pale blue forget-me-not eyes with a burst of red behind them as Hook claws at Peter twice. We'll see the blood on his arm where the scars now are, and we'll see Peter fall down onto the rock. And that's the end of that flash of memory for now. And as it comes back to the present, the antagonist will say something like, pity, echoing what he'd said to Ace before he killed him. And he'll say to Peter something like, if only you could remember, then perhaps you might learn. And then this antagonist will slash at Peter in a very similar movement to how Hook clawed at him in the flashback, and Peter will only just jump back in time, but he will get caught by the end of this blade, and it will slash him right across the heart. And this is sort of like a parallel to Barrie saying that children are gay and innocent and heartless, and the heartlessness of children, and Peter being heartless, so he's been stabbed across the heart. Peter will be absolutely shocked and floored by this. Number 1, again, he's done something wrong, he's been bested. Number 2, as Barrie writes, Peter forgets, and so he always forgets when someone has behaved unfairly to him. And when Hook behaved unfairly by Peter offering him an arm and he bit him twice with the hook instead, it was as if it was the first time someone had ever been unfair to him. Now Peter obviously forgets this as he goes on, which is almost a cruelty because every unfairness is the first one to Peter. So this, once again, is as if it's his first unfairness. Very good point for the actor there. Treat it like it's his first time. Despite these flashes of memory, he's still feeling this for the first time, and he will clutch at it and just look confused and angry and hurt, and then he will stagger to the edge of the ship. He won't be able to fly away, and Peter will fall into the water. Perhaps he might even stagger off the edge of the plank where Aces was thrown before in a similar sort of fashion. Peter will topple into the water, and the last thing we hear is the antagonist and the pirates laughing. Peter falls under the water. It's dark. It's dark ocean water and it's deep. As he's falling, he gets more memory flashes back from Maruna's Rock. We hear Hook's laughter. Maybe the antagonist's laughter fades into Hook's laughter and they sound very, very similar. And then Peter sort of fades out of consciousness as we hear the tick-tock, tick-tock of the crocodile. As Peter starts to hit the rocky, sandy floor of the ocean, that is when we have the last flash of memory, where Peter is standing on a tiny, tiny spit of Maruna's Rock, all alone looking out at this dark water as night starts to fall, and he says, to die will be an awfully big adventure. And that's the last flash memory we have as we come back to the present, and Peter is lying on the ocean floor. And there is some blood around him, but not too much. And he starts to run out of air and he starts to choke. Now it's dark down here, so it won't be as cheerful as the mermaids in the Hook version, but there is sort of the coral reef, and we can see off in the distance, we can see the mermaid doors of the grottos that they live in and the little bells above the doors. Maybe we hear bells in the distance, which is what Peter heard when he was standing on Maruna's rock. He heard the mermaids going to bed and we hear all the little bells. So maybe this time we hear the bells as mermaids come out. Now use those fantastic wigs, use all of the stuff from Hook the movie, but make it better. The mermaids come out. They're curious at first and they see Peter, they circle him, and then realizing what's happening, they will fetch some of their bubbles, and Peter will be able to take it and he'll suck air out of it and he'll be able to breathe. And eventually Peter will make his way through the water away from the pirate ship. So perhaps here we can sort of see more of the mermaids in the underwater section of Neverland. I really want more mermaids. And he can go through, perhaps we go past the body of Ace as well. And Peter would not think to bring the body with him. Perhaps the mermaids can do something, they can cocoon it in seaweed and just wrap him under the floor. And we can see another look in Peter's eyes of just not quite understanding. When he thought Wendy Darling was dead, Peter said, "Wendy is dead." And the directions said he is not so much pained by this as puzzled. Death perplexes and confuses him. And so maybe that can be explored here as well. Peter, with these bubbles, the help of the mermaids, eventually he will come out of the water, far away, sort of on the beachy shores, another place, another part of the Neverland. At this point we can flash back to the antagonist. Maybe they are talking to the pirates. They're starting to piece together a plan. The antagonist brings out more of their charts and they start talking about Peter. They start talking about how they are going to be victorious once again over Hook. And we start to realise that the charts they have are something to do with Peter. Cutting back to Peter, we see that he has struck out for the surface and he has clambered up onto this beach and he is making his way back through the Neverlands. And this way we get to see more of the creatures that inhabit the Neverland. There are gnome tailors, there's an old woman with a hooked nose, there are so many different creatures. And the Neverland is inhabited by loads and loads of people. It's not just Peter Pan, the Lost Boys, the pirates, and I'm saying this word because that's what was written in the original text, the Indians. At some point, the blood and Peter's presence on the ground, because remember he does usually fly, this will attract either a group of lions or wolves. And what will happen then is we'll have a bit where Peter engages in more play. And we'll see again how quickly he just jumps from sad to play to sad to play. And he will start to sort of look like he's going to try and fight off these creatures. And they will be snarling and snapping at him. And what Peter will do is something that he did in the book. He will draw a big circle around him on the ground. He will challenge these creatures, whatever they are, tigers, lions, wolves, whatever. He will challenge whoever dares to step into his circle to come and face him. But none of them will. And this is just another mark of Peter. The Neverland is his being, it's his place. And Peter is never bested. And Peter believes this. He believes that never in his life has anyone or anything ever bested him. He believes that once again. He has completely forgotten already. And Peter is laughing once again. Perhaps as he's flying back, he meets some Neverbugs. Now this can be a call to Hook the movie, where at the end he mentions Neverbugs who fly up to him and investigate the wound on his chest. And maybe they use their silk thread and they start patching him up. And this tickles and it makes people laugh even more. And it's just another adventure that he's had. And he's laughing. And as the Neverbugs tickle, they fly away. He arrives back at the Lost Boys hideout and he's still gaily laughing, so heartlessly, so happily. And then we see the Lost Boys and Rufio have all got little lights and they are sending them up into the sky and they are having a memorial wake for Ace. We see that Rufio is the leader. He is front and center. He is helping the smaller boys to send their lights into the sky. I'm not sure what they would be, some sort of magical little light they're sending up, and they all sort of join the stars, that kind of thing. It doesn't matter too much. It's a beautiful moment. It looks pretty. The music is sorrowful and haunting and sad, and Peter is laughing. Perhaps some of the boys, perhaps Rufio, look over and they hear him laughing, and there's just a look on their faces. But again, I want to do it with not too much dialogue. They don't need to shout at each other, not yet. And Peter watches what they're doing and he doesn't understand. But as the lights fly off into the sky, maybe we follow one of them and they drift off into the sky. We cut back to Peter and all the boys have sort of turned away from him and Rufio's turned away and he's sort of maybe comforting the boys, and Peter shoots off into the sky. We might see a look on his face, a look of an idea or a thought or a memory, something. There's a brief flash of something in Peter's face. Maybe we see the lights reflected in his face. It's quite bright. And then Peter disappears off into the sky. The important thing here is that we see Rufio seem like much more of a leader to these boys, a comforting figure, and he stands with them. Maybe he's holding onto one of the smaller ones, maybe Pockets, if that's his name. I think his name's Pockets, the little one. And That's the big important thing to show here, that Rufio has established himself and he is taking care of these boys. And there will always be this space between Peter and everybody. I do want to continue that. Peter won't and cannot touch people and will not. And that's a line that will never be crossed. And so seeing Rufio holding and comforting the boys, that is so different. Like, that is something Peter can and will never give them. And it doesn't need to be verbalized at any point. It's just a little visual thing that is just a big difference between Peter and Rufio. After that sort of establishing scene, I think we should catch up with Peter fairly quickly. We'll catch up with him as he's soaring through a dark night sky, sort of flying. He's looking for something. He's looking around. It's all dark. There is like a few stars hither and thither, and he's got a starlight in his skin and everything. And then eventually he spots something far ahead, and he flies on faster. Zoom, and he goes flying faster. And then we see that it's Ace. Now, I'm in two minds here, because part of me thinks it would be a really cool and clever sort of flash to see Ace be the boy from the very beginning of the movie, the kid that Peter kept company and then watched go into the bright light. And because we didn't get to see much of Ace's face while he was being held by the captain, we could reveal that. I think it could be quite neat to sort of tie in rather than it just being a random child. But also I think it doesn't matter if it's a random child at the beginning, because it is still showing a part of Peter's nature. But either way, we will get this scene and it will be very similar to the beginning, where Peter will say, "Don't be frightened," and Aces will look. Peter will accompany Ace to the light, Ace will go into the light, and Peter will look at it. I think it works both ways, because what I am showing here is a canonical piece of Peter Pan's story, which is that he accompanies dead children part of the way to the afterlife so they won't be frightened. And I think that is dark and haunting and beautiful. And if we can show that as part of Peter's character, partly to show a sort of positive side to him as well, then I think that's really important. And it's also a very, very sort of cool, haunting, dark take on the story. Next, I think we should go back to the antagonist again. They are marking off more time on their charts. They're probably wearing a different outfit. Time has obviously passed on the Neverland, and they are very clearly now documenting how long Peter Pan has been away from the Neverland. And we can see they've been doing this for a really long time. They start speaking out loud as they go through these charts. They talk about how it's been a few weeks, maybe it's been 2 to 3, something like that, maybe 4, maybe longer, but they talk about how long it has been. And then they muse over wondering whether it feels like that long to Peter, whether he even knows how long he's away. It's definitely anger and hate, just as much as sort of Hook really was riled up and did not like Peter and wanted him dead. And there's that tiny hint of envy for the way Peter can just be careless and free. The antagonist then goes on to discuss how calm things are on the Neverland when Peter is away, when Peter is gone. We can maybe be shown scenes of what's happening on the Neverland. The pirates' port is bustling and they're all just chilling out. The Lost Boys are playing and going around the island. We are shown, and the antagonist explains and says that if pirates and Lost Boys bump into each other when Peter's away, they just bite their thumbs at each other. This is something Barrie did write into his story as well. And we can be shown this as well. As the antagonist is speaking, we'll see Lost Boys run into some pirates and just, they don't fight, they don't engage. The antagonist will talk about how Peter is always the instigator, has to have adventures all the time, and Peter has to have things all the time, and how they are just playing his game. The antagonist then, still out loud, wonders how things will change when Peter is dead, and then proclaims that they will rid the world of that boy by taking everything from him piece by piece until Peter Pan is just a story. And perhaps as this scene fades, we see that the antagonist was speaking to Rufio the whole time, and Rufio nods. Now we go back to the Lost Boys in the treetops hideout. It has been a few weeks, maybe a couple of months. The Lost Boys are sort of like clanging pots and they're preparing this make-believe meal, and they're bringing it all out onto this huge like sort of table thing where they all sit and they're having the meal. And then Peter arrives back, and Rufio is about to take the seat at the head of the table, but Peter flies down and sits in it, and maybe he crows as he comes down, and the boys all on instinct sort of shout "Peter!" as he lands, and he sits in his chair at the head of the table. And Rufio sort of releases his touch on the back of the chair and stalks around to sit at the other end of the table. There's no other head chair at the table, so he sort of sits as far away from Peter as he can on the opposite end. Peter starts to tell them about an adventure. Maybe he tells them about some gnomes that he met, but then every time he starts to tell a story, he gets distracted by another. A lot of the boys are sort of taking in these stories, but a lot of them also just, it's not that they don't believe him, they just look frustrated that he can't remember or tell them much about it. This is frustrating a lot of the boys, if nothing else because he can't answer their questions. Rufio is just staring stonily at him from the other end of the table, in that way that he was staring at Mr. Banning in the Hook movie. Just that look that he does so well, just that, look. At this point, they'll all start eating the make-believe meal, and at some point over the chatter, Peter will be saying something and Rufio will say something back, and it will be fairly snappy. And Peter will then snap something back, and so the insult game will begin. And much like in the Hook movie, we will immediately get the impression that this is a game that is played regularly. But then Rufio will say something that he really means and is just not part of the fun of the game. You're a filthy forgetter, you're a failure, you've got false promises, you know, sort of playing on the alliteration thing, but he will call him a failure and he will call him a filthy forgetter, something like that. This will stun Peter enough that Rufio has essentially won because Peter can't immediately clap back. And this will be another point where Peter feels like he has failed. The boys who are on Rufio's side cheer, and some of the people who are on Peter's side are disappointed, and some of the ones in the middle are sort of giving him a look, and Peter cannot handle this. So he jumps up onto the table, and actually in a similar move to how Rufio behaved in Hook to Mr. Banning, throws something, a coconut, something at Rufio, who will either deflect it himself or one of the boys will deflect it. And then Rufio and Peter will either throw things at each other or start to fight. I think it'd be way more fun to have them actually fight with swords because there's not enough fighting in this movie. Like, there just isn't. Like, just yeah. In my version of the movie, Rufio and Peter Pan will have a actual all-out fight, like sword fight. But after a while, Rufio stops the fight, echoes something similar to what the antagonist said towards the beginning, and says, "Fighting is what you want. I'm not playing your game." And much like in the movie Hook, Rufio will use his sword to draw a line in the ground, in the dirt. Anyone who wants to play his games, anyone who wants to follow a filthy forgetter and just be forgotten about, then stay on his side. And a good chunk of the Lost Boys will come onto Rufio's side. Peter will obviously be pissed off by this, so he will try to win back the Lost Boys by playing, which is almost the worst thing possible to do. I'm not sure what game, maybe he will try to initiate a food fight, that kind of thing, and it will seem fun. But Rufio will just stand there and on his side of the line, he will say, "That's all you're ever going to be. That's all you ever are. It's all just pretend. It's just make-believe. You'll always forget." And at this point, Peter will lose pretty much the rest of the boys and they will go to Rufio's side. And then Peter will leave the Lost Boys hideout. The next thing that I would like to use from the original Hook movie is that scene where Mr. Banning rediscovers the home under the ground and he has all these flashes of memory. Now, I would like to do it slightly differently and better. Peter will wander the Neverland, trying to come to terms with how he's feeling, but also not really feeling the way that people think he probably is feeling either. His feet are carrying him and his brain isn't really thinking about where he's going. And it will sort of be a autopilot almost that he ends up at this cluster of trees that we saw him and the boys go past earlier. And because the moss has been moved from one of them, Peter will see Wendy's tree. And he might even say it as he sees it, "Wendy." And maybe we have a flash of him saying, "Come away," to Wendy in that scene at Darling's nursery, because you've got to reuse that nursery because it's so epic, that set. And then he'll go around and he'll find other trees. He'll wipe off names. He might find Michael or John. He might find Slightly or Tootles or twins. And then he'll find Peter engraved on one tree. And he'll pull all the brambles and the thickets off this tree in the moss and he'll push it aside and he'll find this slither, this hollow in this tree. And he'll turn sideways and he'll slide into it and he fits perfectly like a glove. It's his tree because Peter obviously hasn't grown. And then he will burrow his way down into the home under the ground. And then we'll get a similar sort of scene to in Hook, where we see the home under the ground and it's dark and dusty and everything's covered in earth. Now, there was a tree in the middle of the hideout that they would always saw down so that they could put the table and things on it, and they have to saw it down every single day. And obviously over the years, this tree has grown back through the floor again. So there's a huge tree in the middle, everything's overgrown, there's cobwebs, there's insects, maybe there's some creatures living there and things. Or maybe it's just dead silent, like no one else is dead going there. Peter will uncover various different things. Maybe he finds sort of John's hat, if you want to be stereotypical, and you have some merry flashes of John and Michael and the Lost Boys and things. He'll find some old toys and stuff. He'll find various different things and he'll have other flashes of memories. And then Peter will find his old panpipes. He will pick them up and he'll brush off the dust. And as Peter raises the panpipes to his lips, this is where we will include Maggie's song from Hook. And we will intersplice with a scene of Rufio and the Lost Boys. And they are sat there in the wake of this realization of Peter not caring and Peter not being there anymore and just feeling completely abandoned by Peter. And this is where Rufio will sing the song. and Peter will be playing the same tune on his panpipes. And we'll cut back and forth, and maybe it's seen that this is a song Peter sang at one point. It doesn't matter too much. The point is, Peter is playing the tune on the panpipes, but Rufio is singing to the boys are joining in, and the Lost Boys are separate from Peter. Perhaps we could even delve further back into Peter's story here. As we go back to Peter in this dark hideout, perhaps he can have a flash of remembering his mother, remember her singing it over his crib, and then he can have a flash of seeing her singing it to another boy in the same crib as he's in front of this barred window. Then he treads on something that crunches. He bends down and he picks up the medicine cup. And as Peter looks at it, puzzled, he has a flash and he remembers Tinkerbell. He remembers the flash of red in Hook's eyes from earlier when he remembers him clawing at him, and then he will remember Tinkerbell drinking this poison, and then he'll remember Tinkerbell dying. It's like in the original story, Peter, when he thought Wendy was dead, he was not so much pained as puzzled, but when Tinkerbell was dead, oh, that really hurt him. He remembers the sorrow, and he will cry out in the present day. He'll cry out, echoing as he did, as we see a sort of flash of the memory of him crying out, clutching at Tinkerbell, and he is clutching at the medicine cup now. And perhaps in the past, as well as in the future, both Peters sort of dropped their knees and they're crying out and they're holding on to the medicine cup and Tinkerbell. Perhaps he starts to sob, and as he lowers his head, we hear this tiny memory of voice saying, "Boy, why are you crying?" And all we hear for a while, like at the beginning of the movie when we just have this one moment of silence for a long beat, we just have Peter completely distraught. No real music, just completely devastated boy. And maybe this cry is letting out all of this stuff that he can never remember he feels. Maybe it's all the sorrow and devastation from years and years and years that he has completely forgotten, that is somewhere in his past that he just doesn't hang on to, and maybe it's all coming out now in this one desperate cry. But then, quietly, like a tiny wisp of smoke, another memory will start to surface. And Peter will remember that he saved Tinkerbell. He'll remember calling out to all the children who believe in fairies and who believe in the Neverland. He will call out to them all, and they all clap their hands and saved Tinkerbell. And he'll remember the joy and the ecstasy and knowing that all these children believe in the Neverland and Tinkerbell and him. And this will empower him in the present day as well. And as he puts the cup down and he stands, the home onto the ground, the whole room is just emblazoned with a warm light. And you can see it under his skin again, the gold and the million golden arrows of his skin, and the sparkles and the starlight in his eyes. It's back and it's bright and it's brilliant. And Peter is imbued with this sense of, people believe in me. I believe in me, and, you know, I'm amazing, and all of this. And he has this grin on his face again, and he is back. So I'm not entirely sure of the order certain things should happen in the final act, because I'm not a scriptwriter, I am just inventing here. But I know how I want it to end, and I know some things I want to happen. So this last bit's sort of more loose ideas than a sort of idea of what scene should cut to what. But based on how the Hook movie went, there should be this moment of triumph, and then a moment of fighting, and then a moment of sorrow, and then a moment of you pull it back from the brink and there's triumph again. I think at some point we should have a scene where it shows that Rufio and a lot of the Lost Boys have approached or been approached by the antagonist and are being convinced over to their side. Unlike Captain Hook, this antagonist is focusing not on fighting the boy and trying to best him physically, because this boy can fly and he's sort of this immortal boy. This antagonist is just trying to make Peter the forgotten thing. Perhaps he just convinces them and says, think of how calm things are and how you can exist and have your own fun when Peter is not here. Wouldn't you like that to be all the time? So you help me to get Peter. You hand over Peter, or you get me a way to get Peter so that I can get him out of the picture forever, and we will live as a truce. Perhaps a lot of the boys can put up defenses and be like, no, you killed our friend kind of thing. And even Rufio, who has spoken to this pirate before, you know, can still have this feeling, and they can twist it again. So it is like, even though they are the one who held the boy at knife point and did kill the boy, it's Peter's fault because Peter didn't save them, and they can get the boys to be on their side and say, yes, we'll hand over Peter Pan, we'll get you Peter Pan. Maybe in a callback to how Captain Hook responded when he asked John Darling what his pirate name would be, and John said, oh, I thought of calling myself Red-Handed Jack. And Captain Hook said, oh, it's a good name. We'd call you that here if you joined us. Maybe this new antagonist can say, oh, what was his name, and seem to genuinely care and go, what was his name, you know, and they can say Ace, and then this antagonist can, you know, sort of feign concern and just say, you know, it's a good name. It's a good name. And this can sort of win them over a little bit as well. The antagonist could also say that if they don't agree to hand over Peter, then they and the pirates will cut down and destroy as many boys as it takes until they get to Peter, because they are going to destroy him anyway, so you can either do this with us or you can be in the way of us doing this, kind of thing. And the boys will agree. They will agree, and perhaps as he handshakes with either Rufio or every single one in turn, perhaps the final word can be for Ace, and that can be the agreement with the boys for Ace. And they agree. They're going to hand over Peter Pan. So now we come to the final sort of showdown of the story. Perhaps Peter can land back at a hideout ready to win the boys back. Perhaps he can land where Rufio had drawn that line in the dirt that's still there. Before he gets very far, they sort of jump and attack him. And perhaps Peter doesn't really want to fight his own boys this time. Perhaps he's trying to win them back to side, or perhaps they're just too quick, and perhaps this is a show of how all of them and Rufio versus the one boy do get the jump on him, and they do get Peter, and they take Peter to the pirates. You then have a big showdown with the antagonist and everything, and the antagonist is talking about how I have been watching you, Pan, and whenever you've been away, the island has been so much better. Do you even know what it's like when you're not here? And maybe they served on Captain Hook's ship when they were younger. Maybe they were one of the pirates who survived the attack, kind of thing, and they can talk about, do you even know Hook was a different man when you weren't here, and how Peter dragged this man down, and how they're not going to let Peter do it to anybody else, including themselves, and they're not going to let Peter just ruin the Neverland and everything else. And Peter will have to win back the boys whilst also fending off the antagonist, Rufio, all these different things. And I think the way Peter would win them back would be this. Peter will remind the Lost Boys how they came to be on the Neverland. He invited some of them from their homes, and they wanted to come with him, that he offered them this adventure. He will talk about some of them, how some of them were lost boys, not claimed in 7 days, and they were sent to the Neverland because they were lost and on their own and uncared for. He'll talk about how that's what it is, that's what the world is. He'll talk about barred windows. Mothers will forget you, they will replace you, they will shut the windows. Your windows are not open anymore. He'll talk about how they were forgotten and lost. No one came to claim you, you were already forgotten. And maybe that could be an angry point, and he can say you were already forgotten, and this can be a point of anger and contention, particularly with Rufio, and the antagonist can be like, haha, I think, you know, they're winning, kind of thing. And then he will go on to explain that he brought them to this place of adventure, and all you leave behind is that sorrow and that hurt, growing up, growing old, and being lost and alone. I went back to my window. Don't you think I once thought like you? I went back to my window, but my mother had barred the window and she'd forgotten all about me. And then he can have his clinching line, which will be, why would I want to remember that? Why would anyone want to remember that? And that's what will win him the boys back. Maybe not all of them, but that's what will win them back. At this point, the fighting will break out. The boys who are on Peter's side will be on Peter's side. Maybe it's Rufio who starts fighting Peter, and maybe the antagonist doesn't even need to draw a sword because this is what they wanted. They wanted to cause this infighting, and they will just clean up whatever's left afterwards. Maybe the Lost Boys can be fighting each other as well, and there's infighting, and then it's Peter and Rufio. And then I am in two minds once again. I don't know if I want Rufio to die. I hated the way he died in Hook, because he just died to be a plot device and a way to make Jack Banning go like, oh, I've had an epiphany, I really care about my father. Nah, if Rufio is going to die, he should be killed by Peter in a fight where they are fighting for control, and it will make even the Lost Boys who are back on Peter's side, it will make them have a juddering moment of just, oh man, he is dangerous. And then I have this line that I wrote for Rufio. So in Hook, Rufio's last line is, I wish I had a dad like you, which is pathetic and annoying, and I wish it never happened. No. This is better. So, it's not better, it's so sad. If Rufio dies, he will say it as he's dying. If he does not die, he can say it when he has a moment where he comes back onto Peter's side. I wish I could forget like you. And then we realize this is the problem. Rufio has probably got flashes of his childhood. Maybe we'll see flashes of Rufio's life. I think they did a Rufio movie about what happened in Rufio's life. Maybe we'll see flashes of Rufio's life and all the stuff he can't forget. And the end of that sentence that he doesn't say is just, but I can't forget. And maybe that's part of what's driving him. Part of why he doesn't like Peter so much is because he kind of is envious, a bit like the antagonist. They're envious that Peter can exist, and every day is a new day. There's always a tomorrow, and there's none of this painful memories weighing you down. And that will either be the last thing that Rufio says, which will shock Peter, and then Rufio is dead, or it'll be the last thing Rufio says as Peter's enemy, and then they'll be on the same side for a while. Now, the antagonist doesn't need to die. They can, it really doesn't matter. I have not put too much thought into the antagonist other than they will do this, they serve this service to the plot, because, well, Hook didn't seem to put too much effort into a lot of their movies, so I'm allowed to have one thing I don't put too much effort into, but mostly because they almost, it doesn't matter who they are, their character is more important than like what they look like and whether they die or not. Like the personality that they have, that's the important thing. They drive this wedge, and that's what happens. And maybe they end up off the ship, and the way the antagonist meets their end is they end up washing up onto the wreckage of the Jolly Roger. Something like that, where they are wrapped up in Hook and trying to emanate this person. Yeah, that would work, that could be fine. So the antagonist is dealt with. Whether or not Rufio is still alive at this point, most of, if not all, the Lost Boys will decide that they maybe have a sort of truce with Peter and they're okay now, but they're not going to stay on the Neverland. And they take the pirate ship and they sail away. Maybe they want to go home and grow up. Maybe they decide they want to go back. But I think what's more likely is they decide they want to have their own adventures, and they're going to be the players of their own game, and they are going to make their own choices. And if Rufio is still alive, Rufio will be their leader and he'll go off with them. If Rufio has died, however, what we will see after that scene is a scene of Peter racing through the dark sky again, and he will accompany Rufio to the afterlife. And there won't be much dialogue, but this time, and Peter will look at the light and he'll watch Rufio go, and maybe Rufio turns and just gives Peter a grin or something, and there's a look of understanding, and Peter just sort of nods, and you see the bright light reflected in his face, but once again, Peter turns away from it, but he is more settled now. And then we will see a scene similar to the beginning of the movie. Much like at the end of Hook, we are back at a nursery at the window again. And maybe this is Granny Wendy, and she's telling stories to her granddaughter Margaret. And when Peter realizes this, you can have a small moment of recognition, and there'll be a grin on his face. And the window is not barred, and the window is open. And the last shot of the movie is Peter stepping inside, and we hear Margaret's voice say, "Hello, what's your name?" And we can hear him say, "I'm Peter Pan." And that's the last line of the movie. And it ends on this hopeful note, because Peter's story will continue to go on, and Peter will continue to forget and continue to live, and the Neverland will go on and on and on. But there's a tiny hope that he has reconciled. And although he will forget and continue on and on, the occasional flashes of remembering might not be so painful for him. But I'm not going to rewrite his character and say, oh, he starts remembering people and he was a much better person, because that's just not true. I think it's just showing that all things come to an end, and when Lost Boys decide they want to leave, they leave. And if they stay, they stay. But the story will go on and on and on, as long as Peter is innocent and heartless. Well, Jellyspoons, that was my rewriting of the movie Hook, taking a bunch of their themes and scenes and casting and all of this and turning it into a brand new movie. Obviously, no offense or disrespect is meant to the memory of Robin Williams. I think he's a great actor, I think he's a great person, but he was just not right for this role. The role should never have been written in the first place. Peter Pan doesn't grow up. I'm very sorry. Perhaps there is a role for him in this movie, because we're sort of imagining that I'd gone back in time and written Hook at the time it was being done. You know, most of the casting people could still be in there, and I don't know who would play Peter Pan. The guy who they had who played the sort of teenage Peter who went in and saw Gwyneth Paltrow's Moira, he looked the part, but we didn't see enough of him for me to know if he could be the actor that I want for this role, so I'm gonna leave that open. Just imagine. Chuck suggestions in the comments below. What did you think of the movie Hook? Tell me in the comments below. What do you think of my complete rejigging of this movie? I completely scrapped the plot, obviously, but I did try to keep a lot of their sets and the scenes and the order in which things happen, just so that it could be vaguely similar in principle, I guess. And I had fun writing this. I went through like 2.5 notebooks, but I had a great deal of fun writing this, and I went back and got to research Peter Pan once again to do my source material checks. So I had great fun. Thank you for watching this 2-part crazy video. Goodbye, Jellyspoons. Until next time, goodbye.